The two most important hormones that we have in our body are, on the one hand, insulin, because it brings down glucose. And then it's also cortisol, because it elevates glucose. But when we talk about the female cycle, I usually focus on estrogen and progesterone. Usually, estrogen is a little higher than progesterone in the first half of the cycle. And progesterone then is a little higher in the second half of the cycle. The reason why it's so important to talk about those two hormones specifically is because they are also very much connected to insulin. During our first half of the cycle, which is called the follicular phase, our estrogen is a little higher. And estrogen is one of the tasks is it increases the insulin sensitivity. That also then means our bodies are a little better with using carbs as an energy source. During the second half of the cycle, we want to use the energy and the source we get in case we are pregnant. So we are able then to help a baby grow, right? So that's why actually our insulin sensitivity is reduced. Our glucose levels stay a little bit more elevated. Also, the way we use the fat storages, for example, are also different during the cycle phases. So let's say we're less efficient at using carbs, so we can keep the energy more to ourselves and potentially a baby.
But that to me sounds like the body doesn't actually know whether it's pregnant or not, which sounds
It takes
surprising.
some time.
Interesting. Welcome back to Biohacking Eve, Health Optimization for Women with Judith Mueller, where we shine a light on everything that will help you reach your best self as a woman, as unique and individual as only you can be. Live long and prosper, my friend. Welcome back to the show. So today I've got Marie-Luise Huber, who's the head of nutrition at Hello Insight. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Super. So Marie-Luise is a nutritional scientist, dietitian, board-certified health and wellness coach, and health advocate. And she helps people, especially women, which is why we're here today, access the knowledge and support they need so they can unleash the power from within and build the healthy lives they desire for themselves and their families. Super. Before we launch into what you do at Hello Inside, we have a very special announcement to make. We may or may not have a guest appearance. Basically, I've got a resident cat here who at any point might decide to jump in front of the camera, so the viewers might see that. If you hear the crash as a listener, then he might have knocked over the microphone, so we'll see. Don't worry, we'll just continue unless he does, basically. Cool. So Marie-Luise, back to you. Tell us about Hello Inside.
So I would say Hello Insight is a company that believes that there's not just one size fits all, right? We know those one size fits all diet, but we at Hello Insight believe that personalized nutrition is actually the holistic approach to health. We even call it the first intelligent metabolic health companion for women throughout life. And we are in CGM, continuous glucose monitor enabled company. And we want to encourage people, as we said, especially women, to understand what is going on in their body, what's going on inside them and what's their body actually signaling them. And so we want to support all women throughout the most important phases of life, whether it's just cycle health or if it's menopause, there's always something we can work on. So that's what we are doing.
Fantastic. Actually, let's stay on the topic of CGM because I've been working with the CGM myself and I've had some very interesting insights. For anyone who has not looked at the glucose goddess, if you check on Instagram, please do have a look. Very interesting. And really, a couple of questions. So I've noticed with my CGM, so I'm seeing different readings for the same foods throughout my cycle. That is one thing. And the other thing I wanted to touch upon is so my blood glucose is actually fairly stable, which I'm very happy to report.
You should be.
Which is a very good thing. So I don't usually spike very much when I eat. Having said that, I did notice that when I put a stressor on my body, so for example, exercise, sauna, cold plunge, etc., I first have a drop, which I suppose makes sense because your body needs to do some actual work. So glucose is dropping. And then I suppose the stress response kicks in. I'm guessing that's cortisol, right?
Yes, correct.
Fantastic. Yes, points. Well done. So cortisol kicked in, which leads to more glucose release. So first I'm having, from a stable baseline, I'm having a drop. And then my blood glucose actually shoots up, which is something I'm not really seeing even when I'm eating. And then it goes back to baseline. Tell us more about that.
So I'm going to answer the second question first, right? So when you talk about cortisol, it's important to understand that cortisol is the stress hormone, right? And I feel like we can even talk about like our ancestors. It's actually cortisol is not all bad, right? Like we only think about stress and this negative thing, but also it's super great that we actually experience the stress because as you mentioned, and as what you saw is it provides the energy. When our glucose goes up, we feel like energized, right? And so for us, it's great to have this like mechanism because it enables us to run away from a tiger or anything like in our ancient times. And so actually seeing that glucose going up when you are stressed is a good sign that your body is functioning, right? Because it provides the energy so that you are able to run away from a tiger if necessary. Or if we like put it into like modern world so that we're able to catch the bus, right? Or that we are able to catch the train because we see it on a platform almost leaving. And so we are already feel stressed and then we get the energy hit. And so we are able to run faster than we would usually feel, right? So I feel like that's super important to understand that cortisol, yes, is a stress hormone. And also we don't want it to be high all the time. But it's also important that we have it because it's like one of our, I call it like the master hormone, because then we are able to function. And if cortisol wouldn't be there, then we would not have the energy available like in a short amount of time.
So what would happen, for example, if a person is under long-term stress? What happens biochemically?
Yeah, that's
And
that's
why
the
is it
thing. Like,
bad?
yeah, that's a very good point, and that's why I said we don't necessarily want it to be high all the time. As I said, like cortisol brings up our glucose because we get the energy. But if we're under like high stress all the time, our glucose levels stay elevated. They don't go down. And that like the constant elevation of those glucose levels is actually the one thing that harms our cells, right? I sometimes call it like it's too much then like burden for our cells. Imagine like it's a neighbor knocking on your door all the time and okay, you don't want to open the door anymore. So I feel like it's just this annoying feeling and hormones are actually getting into the cell. And that's what cortisol is actually doing. They are opening up the cell so that the energy gets in and we are able to move. But if somebody is at the door knocking all the time, we get annoyed by it and we don't react anymore. So I feel like that's important to understand and see that if our cortisol levels are elevated, if we're constant stress, our glucose is elevated all the time. And then our body is not able, our cells are not able to perform the functions anymore because they become ignorant. They don't want to open the door anymore. They don't want to like communicate with each other because they are like, there's somebody like bugging them all the time. And so then we know that affects our health, right? There may be like cardio issues. There may be like, it may increase the risk for diabetes. It potentially even increases the risk for Alzheimer's disease. So there are so many diseases that can come out of being stressed constantly.
So this is really interesting. So how does it harm what sort of on a biochemical level? What are the pathways? How does it actually harm the cell other than being annoyed at constantly stressed, which I think comes with the knocking neighbor? And it almost makes me think if you're having stressful thoughts, can that actually lead you to be diabetic? It sounds like that from what you're saying.
If we have like stressful thoughts a lot of time, yes, it can. And that's when we talk about like the biochemical level, I think like we should understand or let's break it down. Like hormones are like they are chemical messengers, right? They go through the bloodstream and we want them because they keep us healthy. Hormones are the ones that communicate with each other. They all talk to each other. Unfortunately, you cannot touch them. And that's already a little tantalizing because you don't know what they are, right? You cannot touch them. You don't see them. So it's a very intricate composition and like a dance those hormones have. And so they just send signals, just quote unquote, they send then signals to the brain to perform the functions they are assigned to. And when we think about, since we're talking about women's health, right? When we think about the hormones throughout the cycle, they fluctuate because like they have different assignments during a certain phase of this cycle. And it's, for example, let's talk about estrogen, right? Estrogen is the hormone that is higher during the first phase of the cycle. And one of the assignments or like tasks that estrogen is assigned to do is to thicken the mucus layer. The mucus layer is the one that helps us with to grow the fertilized egg, right? So we want that to be thick so that our egg can actually nest in there and go. And so the assignment for estrogen in that case is, okay, that's your task. Make the mucus thicker. But if, for example, there's another hormone, let's say cortisol, which is very loud, which I said is one of the master hormones. If we constantly, our body has to listen to cortisol, it cannot really communicate to estrogen. And thus our cycle takes a toll. And so that's like the micro level is the communication gets out of whack and like the brain is not signaling the cells what they're supposed to do. And then everything becomes like a rocking boat and not functioning anymore.
So if I understand this correctly, there's actually a biochemical chain of reasons why constant stress levels, whether they are physical through overtraining, through running after the bus every morning. I'm always pathologically late, so if I had to commute, that would definitely be a problem. And I'm always reliably 10 minutes late. It's always going to be the next bus. Or even stressful thoughts. You got a stressful job, or you've got whatever toxic relationships in life. That could actually, upset your cycle, all the things that come with it, but could actually prevent you from getting pregnant, for example, if you wanted
Yes,
to be.
correct.
Okay, so even if you took all the supplements, all the medicines, all the other bits, if you've got that going on, there literally is a physiological block, which makes sense, I suppose, because you're signaling the body if you're stressed, it's not a safe environment to reproduce. And reproduction is energetically very, very expensive, so you don't want to waste your energy on that.
Exactly.
Okay, super interesting. Let's stick with the CGM and glucose levels for one more second. What are the ranges that we should be seeing in metabolically healthy women? And actually also let's come back to the cycle thing about insulin resistance at certain points in the cycle. What should you be seeing? And there was another note that I've come across. If you are on a keto diet, very low carb diet, your baseline glucose can actually be higher than the sort of standard measurements.
Correct. So when we talk about the optimum levels are, that's a tricky question. And I say that because as we know, there's just limited data available. It's like limited data available on continuous glucose monitoring for healthy individuals. And then when we talk about women, which is like a subgroup of it, there is even fewer data. So I feel like that's important to consider that. But generally speaking, what we have received from our medical advisors, and I say quote unquote, the lower the glucose levels, the better. And unless you feel like antsy or fatigue or you don't feel good, then it may be a sign that your glucose levels are already too low. So that's like the caveat or like the important message there. But we at Hello Inside, we say the optimum levels throughout the day without eating and without exercise should be between 80 and 110 milligram per deciliter. And they should be fairly stable. We say we don't want them to be like fully flat because that is also a sign like your body is not functioning or working as it's supposed to. Or maybe that the sensor is broken because that also can happen, which we don't want, but it can happen, right? So we really want to see those soft waves, somewhere in between 80 and 110 milligram per deciliter. Go ahead.
When you say without food and without exercise, are you talking fasting blood sugar, or are you saying if you were to filter that out? Or
Yes, it is between the meals. So fasting glucose, we have this gold standard of it should be less than 100 milligram per deciliter. So that's like the blood sample. But it's also important to consider, and I think we have not mentioned that yet, that a continuous glucose monitor is like this little sensor on your arm, and it measures the glucose in the interstitial fluid, which is not the blood, right? The interstitial fluid is like the fluid between the cells. And so whenever you do like a finger prick test or even like the blood draw at the doctor's, you measure different glucose than you measure it with the CGM, because it's like the one is the blood, the other one is like the interstitial fluid, right? So it's important to understand that when you do, for example, the finger prick test or also the blood draw, on the one hand, these are different sources, but then also the glucose values will be a little delayed for the CGM because it takes time for the glucose to actually go from the blood into the interstitial fluid. So there's some time delay. So whenever you wear a CGM and you also do a finger prick test, don't be surprised if the values are different at the same time.
So, how much delay is there? And does that mean the values should be, or the ranges we're looking at for both CGM and finger prick are similar, but one is more reliable than the other?
I wouldn't say one is more reliable than the other, because the benefit of a CGM is that it's continuously, right? You see it all the time, right? So there are benefits in both means of measurement. And then usually like the gold standard, or like what is shown in science, or like in also product, that it's about like 15 minutes delay between the blood and the continuous glucose monitor.
That's a lot. Okay. Interesting. And are you coming back to said 100 fasting glucose is good, or you want to be below 100? The values I've seen, correct me if I'm wrong, and this might also be due to data gaps in women, as we've discussed. So I've seen something like 83 is very good for a healthy individual. You want to be below 90, and apparently 95 and above is already 3 times diabetes risk compared to below that.
It is. I see what you're referring to. Yes. So it's still right now, like the medical consensus is 100, but they are, as I said, like the lower the better. There are already like movements happening to revise that and go even lower. But then it's important also to consider, and that's, I think, like the tricky part with the fasting glucose, when you have like continuous glucose monitor, when do you measure it? The cool thing is that you can see it right away. Like when you wake up, you don't even have to move. But when you go to the doctor's office to get your blood drawn, in most cases, you need to go there, right? So it's already like some time in between the wake up time and actually getting to the doctor. So that's why there's important to keep that in mind, that with the CGM, the measurements or the timing of the measurement, wherein like fasting glucose may be different. Also, and then it brings us back to cortisol, our cortisol levels are usually a little higher in the morning, right? Because as I said, like it signals our body that we need energy so that we can get going. So if you wake up all the time, like every day about the same time, your cortisol levels have like their fluctuations, and you will notice this in your blood, in your CGM data, right? Like the drop, and then like it increases even though you're not doing anything because you're just waking up, right? So I feel like that's super necessary to understand that the cortisol then impacts your glucose. It goes up, but it's in that case, it's a good sign because you are able to wake up. Your body is like ready to go and enjoy a day. So that's why measuring the fasting glucose with a CGM is a little tricky, because when do you actually measure it?
Actually, that's super interesting because I've noticed sort of some drops at night. Also, for example, when I had a nightmare, so I could see it in my aura that my heart rate was elevated, my HRV was down. So clearly sign that I'm stressed. I might even have a period of being awake on light sleep. I'm moving a lot, and then I'm seeing my glucose levels either drop and then even rise in the nightmare. So super interesting. Again, what does stress do with you? Also for me, for example, when I do full blood panel, I've got to get myself to the doctor. And they say, oh, we're doing fasted blood 7 a.m. in the morning before breakfast. I'm like, if you kick me out of bed at 6:55 to take a blood measurement at 7, my cortisol, yeah, I'm stressed because that is not my natural time. Also means I have to wake up with an alarm clock, which I, don't normally do. So there's so many different factors that I think that you also need to be aware of to even be able to listen to your own body. Okay, so coming back to the sort of low carb argument, tell me about what should adjusted ranges be there? Because what I've come across is that and maybe it helps if you can quickly explain the mechanism But I've seen some papers, some studies that say, look, your baseline might be a little bit higher. It might be 90 to 100, maybe even slightly above 100. But you're also not going to see those spikes basically because you're not having the high carb meals.
The thing is, we need like energy and like glucose to function, right? And maybe you know it better than I do, but I would say like 40-50% of the glucose is actually used by our brain. So that's why our like body is just like a super smart machine. So when we don't provide our body with like glucose from the outside, as in carbs, our body is just like producing its own glucose. And that's why the levels are like a little more elevated, so that our body, or like that case, especially our brain, is able to function, right? Because if there's not enough glucose, our brain shuts down. And so that's why when we perform a ketogenic diet, it is actually one way to make sure that our brain is able to function, because it elevates the glucose level so that there will be no scarcity in that sense.
Okay, so that makes a lot more sense. Actually, coming back to the ranges, and also there's two different scales. So for example, when I get a CGM, so I use the Abbott Freestyle Libre 3, which for those who are on camera, you can see it there. It's a little sort of knob on the arm, actually quite, I wouldn't say pleasant to apply, but I thought it was going to be a lot worse actually.
A mosquito bite is worse.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have all the slapping yourself. It doesn't involve any slapping yourself. And it's actually surprisingly painless when you have it in there. So I really don't notice. So coming back to the whole setup, I actually set my scales differently. So the Abbott default scale, I believe, is 70 to 180 off the top of my head.
Yes.
I've set it to 70 to 140 because 140 and above is basically much increased risk factor for diabetes, etc., etc. So basically, the idea is you want to minimize spikes and also the sort of area under the curve any time you spend in 140
Correct.
and above. Actually, maybe can you tell us a little bit about why that is so stressful on the cells? What happens exactly?
Mm-hmm. So to get on to talk a little bit about the ranges first, I think it's important to see, it's great that you adjusted that. And it also like already alludes to the fact that the CGMs, the way they are set up, they are used for people with diabetes, right? And like their ranges, their optimal ranges are far bigger than they are for quote unquote healthy individuals, right? And so that's why there is this discrepancy between what our range is, what other competitors' ranges have, or what the range in Abbott is. So I feel like that's necessary to understand. And then to your question, like why do we want to reduce the amount, like the area under the curve above 140, is because we have seen like data shows that, again, what we talked about, the more our glucose levels are elevated, the more also then in return, it's stress on our body. And sometimes I call it like a little like arrow that's actually pinching our cells and breaking down the structure of ours. And then our cells are not as responsive anymore to insulin, for example. Insulin is the hormone that brings down our glucose. And so if our cells are already broken, or let's say what's it called? The lock is already like a little bit like broken. Insulin is actually the key that opens the lock, right? So if that lock is broken, insulin cannot function and it's supposed to. And so the glucose levels don't come down anymore. And then if they stay elevated for too long, then it also then goes into what I've said, like it hurts our cells, it hurts our nervous system, it hurts like how our brain responds. So it's similar to what I have said earlier about the stress. It's the same thing for if our glucose levels are elevated for too long.
So when you say it hurts the structure of the cells, is that a metaphor? Is that there's some actual organelles, mitochondria, whatever else it might be, that are actually damaged from that?
Both. So I use it as a metaphor, but you can see that the cell structures are actually changing. I'm not entirely sure if it's the mitochondria or any other parts in our cells, but you can see there is a change in the shape, quote unquote, of the cell.
So the shape is changing and therefore also the functionality, I'm
Yes.
guessing.
Yes.
Okay, super interesting. Just coming back to the scales really quickly, why are there two different scales? And which one should you use?
You mean different scales between 80 and 110, or?
No, the difference. One's a millimole and one's a milliliter.
Oh, that is from what I have known, from what I have seen, is especially geographically. Most parts in Europe use, or like most parts in the world use that. It's more kind of like the standards that are existing in certain countries. That's from what I know. Like it's the way the glucose is measured in labs and like the test methods they use versus just like really a functional aspect to it.
So there's no upside, downside. And I know
No.
there's also very clear conversion scales you can look it up.
Yes,
So
correct.
just be clear on the guidance, basically. Okay. And coming back to hormonal cycles, menstrual cycles, and insulin resistance, talk us through all of that shebang.
Where should I start? There's so much.
At the top.
So as I said, like at first, when we talk about like hormones, I would say the two most important hormones that we have in our body are, on the one hand, insulin, because it brings down glucose. And then it's also cortisol because it elevates glucose. And then we have, I would say there's a wide variety of hormones. But when we talk about the female cycle, I usually focus on estrogen and progesterone. And the reason for that is those two, they communicate, as we said, like hormones communicate with each other. And so they are like at different levels throughout the cycle. Usually estrogen is a little higher than progesterone in the first half of the cycle. And progesterone then is a little higher in the second half of the cycle. You have those hormones in your bloodstream all the time, but it's just like the relation between, or the ratio between those two changes. And the reason why it's so important to talk about those two hormones specifically is because they are also very much connected to insulin. During our first half of the cycle, which is called the follicular phase, it's easy to remember: follicular first, and then the last one is luteal last. Easy to remember that way. During the first half of the cycle, our estrogen is a little higher, and estrogen is one of the tasks is it increases the insulin sensitivity. That also then means our bodies are a little better with using carbs as an energy source. Yes?
Why does it actually, what's the biological benefit of increasing insulin sensitivity? Or rather, what is the downside or the reason why in the second half of the cycle you wouldn't have that or need that perhaps?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And I was like doing some research on it. Like I have not really found research or solid research, but I was talking to a bunch of like doctors or like people in that field. And my explanation is that during the second half of the cycle, we want to use the energy and like the source we get in case we are pregnant. So we are able then to help a baby grow, right? So that's why actually our insulin sensitivity is reduced. Our glucose levels stay a little bit more elevated. Also, the way we use like the fat storages, for example, are also different during the cycle phases. So let's say we're less efficient at using carbs, so we can keep the energy more to ourselves and potentially a baby. So I would say that's the evolutionary explanation of like why it is a little different.
But that to me sounds like the body doesn't actually know whether it's pregnant or not, which sounds
It takes
surprising.
some time.
Interesting.
But that's what I have talked through. As I said, like I have not found like really any like evolutionary scientific explanation of that. But from like the conversations we had, like we came to the conclusion that this may be the reason so that we are able to help a baby grow.
Interesting. So so coming back to the cycle and insulin sensitivity.
So yes. So then as I said, like during the first half of the cycle, we are like more insulin sensitive, meaning also like we are more efficient in using carbs. During the second half, as I said, we are less insulin sensitive. I wouldn't say insulin resistant. I would quote unquote, we need more insulin to bring the glucose down. And you will notice that I think you even mentioned that when you're wearing a sensor, your blood glucose, either it stays a little more elevated or it just takes more time for the exact same meal to lower your glucose again. Like you could have, I don't know, let's say use like a piece of cake, right? You have one cake and then you eat the same cake, you recreate the same day, but you will notice that your glucose will not go as low or like it will go higher during the second half of the cycle. And that's something we have seen like with many of our users at Hello Inside already, with backed by other scientists, where we see that there's a difference in insulin response, glucose response during the first and the second half of the cycle.
Awesome. So staying with the cycle, menstrual phase, tell us about prostaglandins, cravings, and cramps.
Okay. So prostaglandins are, I would say, the inflammatory hormones, right? So it's during the menstrual cycle, the uterus produces prostaglandins. So they're like hormone-like chemicals. I'm not entirely sure that they are like really, I wouldn't say they're like real hormones as we talked about. And those prostaglandins, they help the uterine contractions so that actually the uterine lining gets out of our body if we're not pregnant, right? And if you eat a lot of like refined sugars and the processed foods, they actually increase this prostaglandin release, making cramps and pain even worse, right? So to break it down like in simpler terms, if you notice like period cramps, I would not recommend eating sweets for the reason that like cramps are already like a signal of the body that it's painful, and it's like the uterine lining, it's contracting, right? The uterus is contracting. And so it's, if you then feed it with sugar, you actually give it more power, quote unquote, so that the cramps get even worse, right? Even more painful. And that's because of the prostaglandin reaction. So if you experience period cramps or notice cravings, it's hard not to give into them. But then I would say learn your way or think about ways that can also distract your thoughts, because often cravings are part of the thought process. And if you're able to redirect those thoughts or eat something that's not sugary, it will help your cramps are getting better. And also redirecting your thoughts will then help you like relax, and then also helping support your like blood sugar response and everything that comes along.
So the short answer is resist the cravings. And I think that's actually a really good thought impulse, and saying that's a good time, maybe not that moment, but that's a good impulse to get off sugar altogether, because this is the hardest time to resist, and you're going to have
Exactly.
the same problem every month. So
Yeah.
if you can actually reduce your sugar intake, get over altogether, make that a habit, or rather lack of sugar, make that a habit, it's going to make your life so much easier down the line.
Exactly. And also like one thing I like to do with our clients is think about like why you experience those cravings. Is it like connected to a certain time, as you said, like during the period phase, like PMS? Or is it a habit because you always come home from work and like you open the fridge, right? And if you're able to redirect your thoughts and break this habit cycle, it will help you in the long run getting rid of those cravings and being able to also then alleviate your menstrual cramps.
So if you're not menstruating, you're probably pregnant, even if your body doesn't know it yet. So
Exactly.
let's go down that route. Tell us about your experience wearing a sensor during pregnancy and postpartum.
That's a very personal question, but I'm happy to answer that. For the listeners, I do have a 8-month-old baby boy at home. And I was in a fortunate situation that because I work for Hello Inside, that I actually could track my glucose prior pregnancy, during pregnancy, and also postpartum. And I also want to mention that this is not something we offer as a service, because we also feel like women, there's so much you need to focus on, like the health of your baby and blood sugar. In case you don't have gestational diabetes, is not the thing you should focus on. Don't stress about your nutrition if you feel good about it, if you feel where you are at right now, and take care of the baby growth first. But as I said, I wore a sensor, and it was, I have to say I was a little nervous because my mom had gestational diabetes when she was pregnant with me, and unfortunately now she's insulin dependent. So that was a little like nerve wracking already, why I was like entering the pregnancy. I'm like, okay, please God, don't make me have a gestational diabetes. And then also like I am at advanced age. That's how they call it. Like I'm 35. So that was another thing where I'm like, okay, need to be on the lookout for that. And I'm like a very active person and I love my sweets, right? Like if we talked about cravings and getting rid of sugar, I'm fully transparent. I do have a sweet tooth. So these kind of like where was my like situation where I was going, like starting from. But also because I know what was happening inside my body and like because I was tracking my glucose prior my pregnancy, I saw which foods will increase my blood sugar. And I was able, or not only I was able, but I never really had any cravings, but I just love cheese. Unfortunately, I'm lactose intolerant, but I love mozzarella lactose free. I love like my Emmental and my Gouda, like all of that. So that's what I'm like, what really helped me getting through the pregnancy. And it was just super interesting to notice that as my pregnancy progressed, it was harder to control my blood sugar, to keep it quote unquote stable or optimize it. Because as the pregnancy progresses, also our hormones shift, right? I don't even know the exact amount, but like they're so many times fold higher than they are before we even get pregnant. And so it's also like similar to, as I mentioned earlier, it's a natural reaction of our body to maintain energy so that the baby is actually able to grow, right? And so it's not as efficient in using glucose. That's also the reason why actually gestational diabetes can develop, because the body wants to take care of the baby and helps it grow. And so I could totally see that during the first few weeks, my blood sugar was fairly easy. Like I would say like fairly as it was prior to maintain it. And then I had my oral glucose tolerance test, I think around like week 26, 28. I'm not entirely sure because I was traveling. And I could see what my glucose was doing when I was drinking the glucola. And then it was just, as I said, that's the cool thing about the continuous glucose monitor, that you can really track the highest point, right? And I could see that actually my highest point of glucose, like the highest glucose elevation, was a little prior to the one time when the blood sample, right? So I think that was just interesting to see like how the timing was aligned. But luckily I passed the test and I did not have gestational diabetes, but I was still like, I actually wanted to wear the sensor during labor, but my sensor broke before the 2 days before I went into labor. So I don't have any data on that. Yeah, so maybe we will see. So yeah, that's something I could tell. And I could really tell it was harder to manage my glucose the further my pregnancy went. And then also during postpartum time, it took some time and it's still not there where it used to be, like where it used to be like a year from now or like a year ago, because my sleep is not where it should be. Our baby is doing great, but still I feel like I don't sleep that well. I do get the amount of hours, but the sleep quality definitely takes a toll. And so also then my body is a little more stressed. So I can definitely see that my baseline glucose levels are not where they have been like 1.5 years ago, let's say it like that. So that's just super interesting to see. Like the human and the female body is just like amazing, but also seeing what this whole process of pregnancy does. And I was fortunate to have, I would quote unquote call it like fairly easy pregnancy. And I wish like every woman would have this experience. And also like my postpartum period was quote unquote easy as well. No postpartum depression, nothing like that. So I feel like that's nice to have it in that sense. But even seeing it, that how it impacted my healthy body without any complications, I can't help myself to wonder what would it look like for women who, for example, go through depression, right? Or who were not that active during pregnancy because of other symptoms, right? So I feel like that's something we need to account for.
And sticking with sleep and glucose, what are the pathways, mechanism behind that in general?
The cool thing or the fascinating thing about sleep is actually that it's like bidirectional. On the one hand, if we don't have such a good sleep quality, you may have seen it with your aura, and I think you also mentioned it with the nightmares you have. When we don't sleep that, our bodies are not as well rested, meaning that if they don't recover that well, if we don't rest that well, we are already at a little elevated stress level. That also then impacts how our bodies respond to glucose or like to foods during the day. So if we are already like at a higher baseline stress level, this also means that our glucose is already a little higher. And then if we add to that we don't make the smartest food choices, our glucose just goes through the roof, exaggerating it. So that's we said, not such a good start into the day. So that's why our glucose levels are impacted by sleep, because we're not that well rested. But then on the other hand, like if our glucose levels before we go to bed are too high, then we also don't sleep that well. Because, as I said, like our body's main function overnight should be like rest and recovery. But if our body is just like continuously working on like monitoring and managing the glucose levels and trying to bring them down so that they can actually work on the rest and recovery function, it's just too much work. So then we also don't sleep that well. So it's like this, it's a vicious cycle of, if you don't sleep that well, your glucose won't respond, or your glucose levels won't respond that well. But then it also impacts how you like sleep again. So it's really important to be able to break that cycle, to understand it. And also, one of the practical recommendations I want to give in that sense is like, really be mindful about your breakfast choices. If you start your breakfast like with very high carbs, like with something sweet, and then, or maybe even like a fasted workout, like super stressed, and then add something sweet to that, welcome to the glucose roller coaster. It won't get better throughout the day.
And actually, you made a very good point on food choices and willpower. And I think this is also something what I've observed in myself. So my number one self-care habit is 9 hours of sleep. And I think this sounds
Good for
outrageous
you.
to a lot of people. But I'm like, yeah, okay, was pregnant people, young mothers excluded. But I think it sounds outrageous even to most people who are not quote unquote affected by that. But for me, this is so important because this also comes back to cravings, right? If you haven't slept well, your willpower muscle, you literally willpower muscle in your brain is not as well rested, just because I think it's a prefrontal cortex making decisions, etc. So you're much more on your primal brain. We're just like, I'm stressed, let me eat something because I don't know why I'm stressed yet because I haven't slept. I don't know why I'm stressed yet, but I might be tired. Let's just eat something. And then you also eat the wrong things. Also, your leptin, ghrelins, your hunger, and your satiety hormones, vice versa. Actually, I should have done the other way around. They're all over the place, and there's just so many things that feed into that. And then you have PMS, etc., playing into that. So I think the long story short, what I'm trying to say is sleep is always super crucial, but especially in your luteal phase, also when you're menstruating, etc., that is just one thing that's going to make your life easier. Also, when you're sleeping, you're not eating. That also helps.
Exactly. And then also what you mentioned, to give you another example, like our brains are wired to like, if you have cravings or if you don't sleep that and you need energy, they just reach for, or like they are wired that you are reach for something that gives them the quick fix. And that's mostly simple carbs, right? Think about like gummy bears or whatever you have. So if you have those cravings and you need the energy, I would say go something like with protein and less carbs, because you still get the energy. You feel so tired after, but it won't like hit that toll like on your glucose so high.
Yeah, and you're not having the ups and downs again. Coming back to gestational diabetes, is there anything we can do to prevent that?
I would say yes, sure. Like there are genetic risk factors, as I said, like advanced gestational age. If you are already overweight, that's another thing. Or if you have a history of gestational diabetes. So these are some factors. But it doesn't mean, I think I'm a good example for that. That doesn't mean that you will get it, right? What you can do is really being mindful about your food choices. That's one thing where I'm like, okay, don't like only eat carbs. I feel like carbs, they are necessary. I would say carbs are necessary. Yes, you need them, but be mindful about it. And everything you can do to set yourself up for success in advance will help you. It will also help your chances of getting pregnant already, as we talked about, like stress, for example. So be mindful about that too. And then also trying to stay active as long as possible. I know that sometimes it can be hard, but like going for a walk will come a long way, because I'm not sure, did we talk about like the power of movement to reduce glucose? Anyway, glucose walking will definitely help you to lower your glucose response. And so these are things, like small things, steps you can take to reduce the risk of gestational diabetes. And these are also already like contributors to even increase the chances of getting pregnant at first hand.
And I think I'm probably being naive here, but just a joke I wanted to crack. You're already carrying your dumbbell around with you anyway. You might as well use it, right?
Exactly. And you will be so much stronger after.
I found that so interesting, actually, that I've actually seen a couple of women in my circle of friends who actually already doing weightlifting beforehand, which you should be doing anyway. See various other episodes on that, please, but a bit of marketing there. But I think it can actually be a very good Kickstarter to get into the best shape of your life almost on many levels. Speaking of staying with low carb, keto, etc., and obviously keto in general for women, like intermittent fasting, like other practices, we don't have that much data yet, but there also seems to be an indication of this can be very beneficial during certain parts of your cycle, when other parts of your cycle you should actually be eating some carbs. If a lady is used to being on a ketogenic diet, either full time or at least the majority of the time, is that something you would recommend or at least not object to keeping on as long as possible, sensible, whatever? Or would you say, no, you actually do need to eat carbs during a pregnancy?
I would actually say you will need some degree of carbs. So if you're full keto during pregnancy, it may take a toll on your health and your baby's health, because the way how our bodies process and like how you provide energy to your baby, I think it's important to keep that in mind. Like, I'm not opposed to having a carb restriction, but still, like, some complex carbs are necessary, especially when we think about what do complex carbs come with, right? They have like certain vitamins. So I'm pro real food and not necessarily only supplementing. And like the needs for certain micronutrients are higher during pregnancy. And that's my reason why I say, yes, please eat carb smart during pregnancy, even though you may have been on a ketogenic diet, to be able to support your baby best with natural occurring foods and not just eating something.
I like to be very hands-on with recommendations. I know this is probably oversimplifying a little bit, but say you've got your average quote unquote 60 kilogram pre-baby woman. How many grams of carbs should you be eating during pregnancy? And maybe also in which trimester, if there's a difference?
That's a good question, and I have not a specific answer. It wouldn't change during the first trimester, that's for sure. It will definitely impact during second and third trimester, but I want to refrain from saying exact amount of carbs.
Fair enough. Okay. All the legal disclaimer, medical disclaimer, every disclaimer at this stage. No, that's fair enough. Coming back to, you mentioned you had a couple of, or what would you say are the most surprising insights either you and or your clients have had either in your private practice previously or at Hello Inside?
The most surprising fact is, on the one hand, what you have already mentioned, like how different during the cycle phases you may react to food. That's one thing. And then also that there are foods you think will not increase your glucose, but they still do. And that's very individual. For example, I'm lucky that I can, let's call it quote unquote, lucky that I can eat pasta without any concern. But as soon as I add some tomato sauce to that, my blood sugar goes through the roof. And I tried that with some kind of like different dumplings and everything, where same food, once with tomato sauce. So it's not necessarily the pasta, it's really the tomato sauce that will bring up my glucose, which I would not think of. You think about tomatoes, you don't think about them as a source of carbs, but there must be something of the processing of tomatoes and heating them that they will then impact your glucose.
It's that, and it could potentially also be the fact that they are nightshades. If you're having, we've got potatoes, peppers of any sort, we've got aubergines, and what do we say, tomatoes. So these are the four prominent members. Everyone reacts to them differently. Also, how they're prepared. So I, for example, and rightly or wrongly, when I do use tomatoes, I de-seed them before I cook them. And then once I've cooked them, I peel them. So it's very appealing to watch me eat. I peel the peel off and spit it back out. So this is something I eat at home alone and not a polite society, basically. But so this may very well have something to do. But this is very interesting. I've also come across cases where people, for example, if you've got any sort of intolerance or even allergy against something, you will have that stress response in your body. For example, a friend of mine said she had the reaction with almonds, which is very nuts, very healthy. You've got your protein, you've got your healthy fats and all the rest of it. And she even activated them, all the kind of funky
Awesome.
things that my kind of people like to do. We'll talk about activating another episode. I'm sure that's something I really like to do. But it's basically removing toxins. It's basically what I'm called. Name is escaping me now, but it's basically the toxins that any sort of a food that doesn't run away, like tree, for example, any sort of tree fruit, tree plants produce to keep, well, I suppose food enemy is what they're called, food predators away. Anyway, long story short, so there might be some things, and I think this is where CGM is really interesting.
Yeah.
Actually, speaking of which, do you know of, or how would you structure a program if someone said, I've got CGM for 2 weeks, I want to find out as much as possible about myself. Is there any way, like today I will have a nut, tomorrow I will have whatever it is, a potato, tomorrow, the day after that, I will have eggs. Is there any sort of, let's call it elimination diet for CGM?
Not that I know of, and it's also nothing that we at Hello Insight would promote. The reason for that is because nutrition is so emotional and also very individual, right? And then it's also seasonal, right? So I feel like if you want to approach such a program to really make it able for a client to follow through, it needs to be individualized, right? And if I were to tell you, hey, you need to eat this and you should not eat that, and it does not fit into your day, the way to enter it would be so much harder, right? Especially, I do understand, like from the clinical perspective, like those elimination diets, they are absolutely necessary for certain kinds of diseases or like to find out. But in that sense, and when you talk about the CGM, it's just you want to understand your individual response. And maybe you don't even eat rice, right? I don't know, right? So if I were to tell you, you have to eat rice to find out like your response to that, then it would just be so much harder to really follow through. And that's why we at Hello Insight don't do it that way. What we do promote and support though is, let's say you wear the sensor for the first time, and we try to encourage our users to keep their nutrition or like their habits for about the same, I would say 3, 4, ideally even 7 days, depending on like how many sensors you have, and then start to incorporate changes after 7 days so that you're able really to see, okay, like what actually increased my blood sugar the most and like how does it fit into my lifestyle? Maybe like during the week is harder than on the weekends or vice versa. And so that's what we support in doing, is try to keep it as normal, quote unquote, during the first week. And then pick 3 things. I usually say pick 3 things that you want to change because they matter to you. Maybe you want to go on a walk more often, or maybe you want to eat a salad always first because that also then impacts your glucose, or you may like meal prepping because that could potentially help with your glucose response. It's really like this individual approach on habits that you want to change versus us telling you what you have to do, because your life is different than mine. Your routines are different than mine. Your preferences in food are different than mine. So that's like where we are coming from.
This is super interesting. I think one thing to know, because we talked about the cycle and insulin sensitivities, is actually might even be worth having 2 weeks of a sensor, and you start on day X of your cycle. Use that as is, keep the data, keep your food diary, also very important, and
Yes.
try to recreate that. Or rather, not recreate, but actually make the changes when you use a second sensor, and don't use
Exactly.
that straight after, but use it on the same cycle
Yeah,
day.
that's also one thing we like. We have like at Hello Insight, we have like different programs, and we have those, it's called Hello Hormones, which is like a cycle-based program, which goes like through the medical cycle for 28 days. And we do have what we call them experiments. So we say, okay, eat a banana in case you want on day 4. And then we give the recommendation to eat the banana on day 21 or 27. And then you're able to compare the data to really see that. So we do give those guided experience, but it's not like very strict that you have to or you have not to.
So if someone really wanted to dig into that, I suppose a good point to start, even if it's by themselves, will be a list of known food intolerances.
Yes, for
even if they
example.
have either tested for or I suppose against them, just to see what happens. And if people wanted to find out more coaching around it, what would be a good way to approach that?
Coaching in the sense of like one-on-one interaction, or I would say buy Hello Inside and like book a nutrition consultation.
Sounds good. No, I think that sounds like a sensible option. I think there's also another thing when we said if things so individual, and I think genetics do play a big component in that. And I've started experimenting also with the longevity clinics that I'm building. Obviously, I'm seeing a lot of genetic testing, genetic advice, etc. Also, how these things are incorporated into anything from disease risk to eat less spinach, more broccoli, for example. Literally to that details. I've seen a couple of very interesting ones. I did one episode with a company called The New, so it's NU, which is a multi-omics platform. So you basically upload your genetic data, your genetic and your epigenetics. So that's your long-term stuff. You also have your, say, medium-term snapshots, I call them. So your blood stool, urine, these kind of things, basically anything you need to go to lab for. And then you can also incorporate your wearables, so your Aura, hopefully also your CGM, etc., etc. And combining all that together. And I think that's really the future of medicine. So I'm very happy to see more of that. Is there any other insights from your clients that you think is quite shareable?
I would say it's one of the feedbacks I have received from one of my clients. She said wearing a CGM was more interesting than reading the latest thriller, because she actually could see what was happening in her body, and seeing that on black on white was just very interesting for her. Like she did, and that goes unisono through all of our users. Like the users who sign up for Hello Inside and the ones that are wearing a CGM, they already have some natural interest in their lifestyle, right? So they want to improve their habits, they want to improve themselves. But then being able really to see it 24/7 just adds like a different layer to that. And it opens the eyes of, as we talked about, stress, right? Like you may enter a meeting and you're like, something's off. And then you check your glucose data and you realize you're stressed. But also, fun story, another user, another client, she was living in a long distance relationship. And I really like to bring this example because she also noticed whenever she was about to see her, I think back then boyfriend, her glucose went up because she was so excited and she was so happy. So again, like stress is not only negative, right? But it also helps you to understand that something is happening in your body. And that's why we need to be so mindful about stress, because it changes the way how your body reacts, right? And so that's why I feel like, yes, stress is mostly negative, but it's also positive. But also then seeing the power of movement, as we talk, movement is a cool thing because in some cases, it brings down your glucose. So it definitely is one tool you can use to leverage to, on the one hand, yes, feel happier because movement makes you feel happy. But then on the other hand, like to support your body in the way how the metabolism works. And that's something we got as a feedback. On the one hand, yes, stress was a big thing, how it impacts your glucose. And also how like the power of movement really helped to see a lot of our users that they actually could and should move more to support their bodies.
And I found that so interesting when people say you have your postprandial walk. And I do that anyway, just so I don't feel sluggish and I get moving. And it's so interesting to see what happens on the CGM. I'll leave that as a spoiler alert for anyone who wants to try the CGM. No, but it's really, as I said, I don't really naturally get spikes because I don't really have high carb meals. But even see what happens there where it says, not flat, I do see a raise, but it doesn't stay long. It only stays a couple of minutes. And I literally go around the block for 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And I think it also highlights what for me, and I keep talking about this, really are the sort of 5 basics. It's eat, move, sleep, stress reduction, socialize, basically spend time with your tribe. And we talked about food, we've talked about sleep, we talked about movement. Again, stress reduction causes all that kind of, and again, spending time with your tribe, that's also to do with stress reduction and cortisol, and it all goes back together, right? Just don't have an 11 p.m. meal with your tribe. Just don't do that.
And then don't go to bed right after.
Exactly. That's run the experiment once and see what happens with the Aura, see what happens with TGM, and it's very, very insightful. And one last question from a confused consumer on behalf of all confused consumers out there. there's so many new things coming to the market. So how is Hello Inside different to, for example, Zoe and whoever's out there?
I have to say, it's been a while since I tested Zoe, so that's the disclaimer there. But from what I see and what I have experienced myself, Zoe has a strong focus on the microbiome and gut health, which is important because our brain and gut are very much connected. So I do see the benefit in that, and I don't want to bash Zoe in any way because I think they're doing an amazing work. What we at Hello Inside do is we look like at the person as a whole. And as I said, like earlier, we provide recommendations on either like movement or sleep or whatever based on your individual needs. So you make like lifestyle decisions throughout the day. And so we react to those, and we really want to support women to change their behavior on different areas. Because, for example, sleep may be easier for you to work on than it may be for me, but it's up to you really to decide on what you want to work on. We provide like what we call like a general health assessment. You have a dashboard where you see the areas of lifestyle that you would need to improve, but then it's up to you to decide what you want. So that's why we're a little different in that sense from Zoe, because we give the power back to you, so you can decide on which areas of lifestyle you want to work on, and it's not only us telling you you need to improve your nutrition.
Actually, that is so interesting because I hear a lot of the time from people saying, you're a biohacker, this sounds really stressful, like you've given up so many things, you've done this, that, and the other. And I'm like, some of these were never really an issue. I've never drunk alcohol, so I don't really miss it. Some of these were difficult when I started. I talk about ice bathing and stuff like that.
Yes.
And so they're like, oh, second nature pretty much. Exaggerate a little bit, but I think you know what I mean. It just becomes second nature to some extent. And I just really say, look, figure out find out, for example, in the case of the CGM, find out what your responses are and then weigh up for yourself. What does that mean? Does that mean you go from 5 glasses of alcohol to 1 glass and you have it 2 hours earlier than you would normally have? That would improve your sleep because it's earlier. Again, it gives your body time to digest that, to absorb them many levels. Again, it's not as much. So I think really find out where your own individual balance is. For example, I was a huge chocoholic as a child. I'm actually, to this date, surprised I didn't get diabetes back then. I think I just got very lucky, to be honest. I was also training a lot, so that probably helped in hindsight, but it was an inordinate amount of chocolate. So do not recommend that. But at the same time, for me, I've completely weaned myself off, let's call it industrial chocolates. For example, I have found the most amazing 99% raw vegan chocolate that most people like, what the beep is this? And I'm like, I really like it. And I do have this every single day. And it's something like whatever works for you. And just find your balance, really. That was Marie-Luise Huber of Hello Inside. Marie-Luise, it was lovely to have you on. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me and giving me the space to talk about my personal pregnancy and everything else regarding like the female menstrual cycle and also what it means to live a healthy, glucose-focused, monitored life. I want to say it that way.
Long live the CGM.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on this transformative journey. Your presence in this community is truly valued. Now, you may not realize it, but your words hold immense power. They have the ability to reach others who may benefit greatly from the wisdom shared here. If you found value in what you heard, I kindly ask you to take a moment to subscribe to Biohacking Eve, leave a glowing review on your preferred podcast platform, and share Biohacking Eve with your friends and family. Your support helps spread the message of health optimization for women far and wide. Lastly, I want to express my gratitude to you for investing in yourself. By prioritizing your well-being, you serve as an inspiration to others. I'm eagerly looking forward to bringing you many more exciting episodes, and thank you for being a vital part of our community. Live long and prosper, my friend. The Biohacking Eve Health Optimization for Women podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice, and no doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be substituted for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of the healthcare professionals for any such conditions. In addition, the information on this podcast does not constitute investment or financial advice.